will be considered as read. The chair now recognizes himself to explain the amendment. The amendment modifies the bill to bill's punctuation. It changes and clarifies in the meaning of the bill and makes it more easily understood. It is not intended in any way to alter the important purpose of the bill, and I urge the amendment, and I yield back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Maryland.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I've got a couple of questions. One is, this states that if there's a determination that the statement would violate the First Amendment to the Constitution, who would make the determination as to whether there's been a First Amendment violation?
Mr. Ivey, I appreciate that if you'd yield.
I yield.
As a member of Foreign Affairs, I've worked with the State Department for many years. The determination of the admissibility of somebody is generally done at the visa granting time. And so what would happen is when they come before the State Department asking for a visa, if there's been evidence or they're on a list that has been given to them, they would prohibit it. If that was not made available, they probably would be granted it.
Okay.
Now, if I can just add one more thing, this kind of technique, for example, has been used regularly for example, people who give money to Hezbollah or some other.
Let me reclaim my time based on that, because that's one where you've got Hezbollah that's on a list that's been determined by the State Department as a terrorist organization, and you would have presumably a document of financial records that show the contribution. So that's pretty straightforward. A determination
Would the gentleman further yield?
If I might, just for a second, if there's a determination about a First Amendment violation, which, as far as I know, isn't particularly within the expertise of the State Department, and normally would be made by a court of law, and I don't see any court process involved in this amendment here. How would the State Department be best positioned to make that determination?
I appreciate that, gentleman, for the yield. Homeland Security and other agencies regularly are the sources undercover. In other words, an individual who is denied entry, for example, for a donation to a group or an association with a group, often would not be told the reason, nor would the State Department.
Well, if I might reclaim my time, I'm not talking about disclosure. I'm talking about the actual constitutional determination that there's been a First Amendment violation. And there's nobody in the State Department particularly that has expertise with respect to that. And I'll add this as well. I mean, the ranking member's comments about, the Pope, for example, I think kind of are particularly resonate with me, but also in the reverse of that. I mean, if we're going to start, I think, stepping into the State Department determinations about who should be allowed to come with obvious diplomatic implications, isn't there a concern about some sort of retaliation coming from other countries, and especially countries, even allies like the UK, that don't have a First Amendment constitutional provision to govern the conduct of, say, a judge who might make a decision with respect to, I don't know, imposing, and I'm saying I don't know a lot because this isn't real clear about the scope of the First Amendment that's covered here. There could be religious implications, there could be speech implications, there could be assembly implications. There are all sorts of things that could fall under this rubric, none of which the State Department is particularly well prepared to make those determinations. There's no court provision for doing it, and I think there's a real concern that I have, at least, about possible retaliation from a diplomatic front. But I'll yield to the gentleman again for comment.
Well, I think it's important to know that the State Department regularly does exclude people for violating people's religious freedom. For example, certainly there's no adjudication there. There's a determination that government official has done
Let's hash that out. Violating people's religious freedom here in the United States?
No, in their country.
Okay, well, but you're talking about somebody who's in the United States explicitly under your amendment here.
Right, we're much more limited in
Okay.
the...
So the example you gave isn't applicable under this provision, right?
No, absolutely, this is a much more limited and nuanced restriction.
Well, okay. I appreciate the gentleman's comments, but I don't think they explain really how this would work, certainly not from a legal standpoint, since there's no apparent process in place for someone who, let's say, is excluded, having the ability to challenge that on constitutional grounds that don't apply to them because they're foreign officials. Big problem, I think. And then the diplomatic spillover, I think, potentially is very problematic. And I'm not aware of us having any kind of hearing where we explored that with our sister committees or the State Department about that. And I see my time's expired, and I'll yield back.
Mr. Chairman?
Mr. Chairman?
We'd recognize the chairman of the full committee.
I think the Chairman, thank you for this bill. State Department, you all were fine with Homeland Security setting up the Disinformation Governance Board. A bunch of bureaucrats in a federal agency telling Americans what they can say, what they can tweet, what they can do. I mean, thank goodness we made a big uproar about that and they decided to disband that. I think this is important to think about in the larger context. Who would have ever thought that you would have Donald Trump, Elon Musk, RFK Jr., and Tulsi Gabbard on the same team? And they're on the same team because there is a move by the left to censor Americans. This is, and FTC, what they did to Elon Musk, sent him hundreds of questions. One of the questions they asked him, if you remember, right after he purchased Twitter was, who are the journalists you're talking to? You talk about attack on the First Amendment. That's unbelievable. You're allowed to talk to journalists in America and not be harassed by your government for doing so. So I appreciate the gentleman bringing this forward. We have seen this all over. The guy in Britain who was going after Elon Musk, he just stepped down. Or excuse me, in France, I guess the EU, what was his name, Mr. Breton or something like that? He just stepped down. So this is it. When I've invited in front of this committee or one of the subcommittees to testify RFK Jr., Tulsi Gabbard, Michael Schellenberger, Matthew Taibbi, all Democrats, took heat for doing it. Invited them in, but they came in to speak about the attack on the First Amendment, particularly people's right to speak. What was interesting when we had RFK Jr. in here in front of the committee, Democrats made a motion to kick him out, to go to executive session. He was in to talk about censorship, and Democrats made a motion to go to executive session so people couldn't hear what he had to say. I found that a little somewhat interesting, particularly when his last name was Kennedy. Maybe the most famous name in Democrat politics for, I don't know, 3/4 of a century. You know, RFK Jr. said something in the committee hearing that he also said when he endorsed President Trump. Statement that stuck with me. He said, when you look at history, it is never the good guys who are for censorship. It's always the bad guys. This is what Mr. Rice is bringing forward is a bill that I think makes good common sense where foreign entities are trying to limit Americans' speech rights and impact their business. So I think this is a good piece of legislation. In light of this environment where Homeland Security was established, a disinformation governance board, in light of this overall environment, this is the kind of legislation I think that makes sense. With that, I would yield back to
The gentleman would
sponsor of the
yield.
bill.
I thank the gentleman. I would make for the record that immigration officials already are given the authority to engage in complex analysis such as whether an alien has engaged in terrorist activity, whether he has associated with organizations hostile to the United States or a totalitarian party. And with that, I would also ask unanimous consent that be placed in the record the now unsealed indictment from Brazil of Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, YouTube, TikTok, and Telegram, and the individuals related to that. Without objection, so ordered.
Would the gentleman yield for a question?
I think you both, have you? Yeah, go ahead.
I've spoken already. Yeah.
You know what, I'll recognize myself and yield to you.
I just out of curiosity, you mentioned the indictment. Who would be excluded based on that indictment under your provision here from entering the United States?
There could be a decision based on, for example, the judges or officials that led that indictment if it was shown that it stifled the free speech in so doing so.
All right.
I'm not making that claim. And again, understand that all we're saying is that people have no right to come to the United States unless, no, wait a second, it's my time, unless they're American citizens. The ability to come to the United States is a privilege, not a right. And that privilege is withheld for virtually no reason at all in the discretion of the State Department and the United States government, and they do so regularly for a myriad of reasons. The fact is that what we are talking about is simply saying that this is a perfectly good reason. Now, I might note that the First Amendment does speak to religious freedom, and it speaks of religious freedom in a way in which, as a Catholic, I would say the Pope is on good ground to say anything he wants and not have that problem, and he can tell his cardinals to tell the priest anything he wants and not have a problem. Nowhere in this bill would it limit the ability of individuals like that to come. And again, this is a tool when found to be abusive that could be used. I think I'll recognize the full committee ranking member.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First, let me just note that the Twitter subpoena that was mentioned earlier was a friendly subpoena and primarily served as a vehicle for Elon Musk to make public 500-plus pages of sealed Brazilian court documents. And I now yield to the gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Ivey.
Thank you. With respect to the larger point, I think it's troubling to suggest that a judge, in this case in Brazil, could be excluded from the United States under no finding that that judge did anything wrong under the laws of his country, Brazil. With respect to an indictment, I don't know how their process works. I don't even know if the judge issued the indictment, maybe. But in absence of some kind of finding of misconduct, I think that's a problem, especially since it's not aimed at having anything to do with the First Amendment in the United States. And by the way, I haven't had a chance to see the indictment. I appreciate the chairman presenting it, but we're still back to the point of who would review that indictment. Somebody at the State Department, I suppose, to make a determination under the U.S. Constitution that there's a First Amendment violation based on what the indictment does. And to your point with respect to the Pope, I appreciate your view about it, but again, it's not your call to make under your amendment as to whether the Pope telling a bishop you can't talk about X isn't a First Amendment violation. It might be. And the freedom of religion doesn't mean, that means they have the right to, worship in the way that they like. That's different than person X telling person Y under your amendment that you can or cannot say something that he would have the right to say under the First Amendment. Under your express language here, because you don't have an exception for religious freedom or anything along those lines under this language, the Pope could be excluded from the United States based on your language here, just for giving that order with respect to a bishop.
With the ranking
So I would yield back to the ranking member.
I yield to the gentleman.
Thank you. There is a broad waiver authority, which this does not preempt, that the administration always has for certain aliens who would otherwise be inadmissible to the United States. The discretion authority helps alleviate any adverse foreign policy considerations. In other words, the administration, in spite of that action, could admit anyone, and with some regularity, they make those decisions.
Reclaiming my time. The Pope or someone less well-known than the Pope should not have to rely on the discretion of the federal administration for admission to this country. People have legal rights, and under this bill, using as an example the Pope, he would not have a right to enter this country, and one should not rely on the administration. Now, the administration obviously would grant the deferral to the Pope, but not to someone less well known, and that the administration may never have heard of. So the legislation has to apply to everyone, and it applies in a very bad way, and that's why it's bad legislation. And if Mr. Ivey wants to continue, I'll yield back to him. Then I'll yield back.
We go to the gentleman from California, Mr. McClintock, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First, I want to thank the ranking member for his remarkable sense of humor, and I certainly appreciated his lightening the mood around here by warning against the impending shutdown hours after he voted against a measure that would prevent a shutdown. But this is no time for levity. On the merits of the bill, I'd suggest that if you can say it on a street corner, you ought to be able to say it on the internet. Even if it is something vile, foolish, false, insulting, the best way to deal with it is to defend the freedom of others, to counter it with something that is wise or true or virtuous, and then trust the American people to be able to tell the difference. And no foreign official should ever be allowed to interfere with this constitutional right of every American to speak freely and without fear. This bill simply says that any foreign officials who try to censor the speech of Americans are not welcome here. You know, we make determinations all the time over conduct that makes an individual inadmissible into our country or removable from our country, as Mr. Ice has pointed out. And that includes such ambiguous terms as moral turpitude. Well, this is a much more specific offense. And what's shocking is the Democrats once fiercely defended the freedom of speech as we did. This was something that we all agreed on. And that seems to be falling apart. You know, Churchill issued a chilling warning to the world when he looked at the dictators in Europe in the 1930s, and he said, you see these dictators on their pedestals surrounded by the bayonets of their soldiers and the truncheons of their police, but in their hearts there is unspoken fear. They are afraid of words and thoughts, words spoken abroad, thoughts stirring at home, all the more powerful because forbidden terrify them. A tiny mouse, a little mouse of thought enters the room, and these potentates are thrown into panic. They are afraid of the workings of the human mind. He went on to say that such a society cannot long endure when brought into contact with the healthy outside world. Well, in case it has escaped my friend's notice, we are the healthy outside world because we have the freedom to speak our minds and express our thoughts without interference from our self-proclaimed betters, whether they live in this country or abroad. And with that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Mr. Biggs.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
thank you. I was intrigued by the ranking member's argument because he kept using the word right. The Pope has a right to enter our country. Somebody less well known than the Pope has a right to enter the country. And so I thought of the chairman and what he said, as he accurately said, it's a privilege. It's a privilege to enter this country. And so I would ask the chairman if you'd intrigue me with this. Does the Pope have a right to enter this country?
No.
Well, I agree with that. And so if you take the argument that was made earlier that I was listening to, is the implication was that you have to show a violation to somebody who's entering this country before you can keep them out. And the reality is we have a myriad of regulations to control that, and we have waivers that allow decisions to be made, but it is nevertheless not a right to enter this country.
Absolutely. If the gentleman would yield just for a moment.
Yes, of course.
You know, we've been talking about some for cause that are very scary, but the most common reason for someone to have a visa denied around the world is based on their likelihood of leaving. That people throughout the world come to the embassy and a judgment call is made by this relatively young embassy staffer that somebody will or will not, at the end of their visiting visa, their student visa, their tourist visa, leave the country. And if they make a determination that they don't have a long enough, a deep enough anchor to their home country, they will be denied. And that sounds harsh, but that is and has been for more than 100 years one of the most important standards leading to it. Yes, on occasions there's some additional items like they're coming to learn how to fly an airplane but not land it. I yield back.
Thank you. And I don't want to belabor the point too much, but I think the bill is common sense, and I associate with myself with most of Mr. McClintock's statements. But with that, Mr.
Would
Chairman,
the gentleman yield just for...
Yeah, I'll yield to you, Mr.
Just
Chairman.
one more small comment. We have looked at Brazil, where there's a legal filing that names all of these companies, not just one, and certainly Facebook would probably be one that the Democrats like better than the Republicans. But having said that, the amazing thing is we haven't used the word China once, a place where the government regularly stifles all the free speech, including Americans. So I will tell you that when I was drafting this bill, I was thinking China, even though they have not been named today. I think the examples, public examples, are so much easier because it's Brazil, it's UK, and so on, and we want them to change their behavior. But let's understand, it's about time we start pushing out people such as the Consul General in New York, the Chinese Consul General, who is here today, who was on Facebook day before yesterday, who in fact organized and paid for the beating of American citizens because they were protesting in San Francisco. So yes, I have a lot of examples of wrongdoing that I really want to work on, but yes, this administration has used their decision-making to not enforce when, in fact, everyone on this dais, on both sides, would say that after a Chinese official pays to get Americans beat because they're protesting in America their free speech, they should be pushed out, but have not been. So I thank the gentleman for
Will the gentleman yield?
Yes, I'll yield, Mr. Ivey.
Okay, so it sounds like what you're saying is that foreign officials like President Xi from China, President Erdogan from Turkey, Viktor Orban from Hungary should be excluded from coming to the United States because they've all made statements along those lines.
So I'll reclaim my time here first. No, I'm going to respond to that. I guess my point would be, what you're insinuating is that they all have an absolute protected right to enter this nation, and I am contesting that. They don't have an absolute right to enter this country, and this bill just points out that, and I'm out of time, so I'll yield back.
Anyone else seek recognition? Seeing none. Okay. The gentlelady is recognized for purposes of offering an amendment.
Thank you. I have an amendment at the desk.
You know, we've had a variety.
I'll note to the gentleman, I'm happy for us to just go to the previous question. There's no intent to bait anyone.
I wish you'd said that before the full committee chair made his comments, but I appreciate that, Mr. Chairman. You know, look, we've had a discussion here in the Judiciary Committee and the Homeland Security Committee about this issue. I think, and the one I remember here in this committee was a focus on, I want to say it was a district court ruling. I'm sorry, I didn't know we were going to go down this rabbit hole. I would have brought it. And I remember the chairman reading extensively about how that district court judge had found all kinds of censorship and misconduct by the Biden administration and the social media platforms. And I want to note that all of that language was thrown out, actually, when it went up on appeal. And there was a finding also that a lot of the factual findings the district court had made in support of the comments that were the type of comments that were made by the chairman were rejected as being false. So that's number one. Number two, for this committee, I got to go back to Nina Jankowicz, who was briefly appointed to run the entity in the Homeland Security effort that was aimed at addressing disinformation and false information. She basically got run out of the government, I apologize, by comments that were made by members of this committee online So you want to talk about impacting someone's, not just First Amendment rights, but rights to live. She ended up having to get personal security to protect her because after the members made those comments online, people started coming after her. She hired personal security. They told her that she needed to change her address and move. She went to, she was pregnant at the time, so she went to see her OBGYN. She had to go in disguise in order to avoid the harassment and the risk that was created by the comments that were made that I thought were unfounded. And, you know, she testified about that before this committee in one of the interviews that was conducted. It was recorded. I don't know if it's ever been made public, but, you know, certainly that incident's been made public too. So, you know, Mr. Chairman, I guess we can disagree on the factual basis for what you're talking about. I'll say this, though, just as a quick reminder. We've got an election coming up, and I know there's disputes about what's happened in previous elections, but it's very clear that adversary countries, Russia, China, Iran, are making complete efforts to have an impact on our elections, presidential and otherwise, using disinformation, false information, and misinformation online. And we no longer have any mechanism in place at the federal government level to defend against that. So, you know, you got what you wanted, I suppose, in some respect. This might be one of those unintentional consequences, but we are clearly not prepared to address that. Not at all. So with respect to this particular amendment, you know, let's at least be clear about what the intent of the legislation is behind it. But, and we've talked about some of the particulars, the substantive issues, and, you know, who can get deported, who doesn't. I think the impact on the State Department and diplomacy with respect to the United States of America, without having anybody from the State Department come in here and talk about the potential implications, is ridiculous, especially in the context of, we talked about the Pope, we talked about different foreign leaders and all that, and you know, you're saying they may be exempted or there's a waiver. The language in this amendment says any alien, doesn't talk about any kind of waiver or anything like that. It says any alien, and it also says there's inadmissibility, but there's also deportability. So under this provision, somebody who's here, a foreign dignitary, leader of another nation, could be deported based on the statements that they're making under the provision you've got here. And I just think it's astonishing that we would put together legislation that could lead to that kind of result. I mean, do we need that kind of international incident without consulting with anybody who has any kind of work or role or expertise in dealing with those sorts of things? The world's a dangerous place right now. I don't think we need to layer this kind of thing on top of it. And with that, I'm out of time. I yield back.
For what purposes, gentlemen from, what can we do, New Jersey seek recognition?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think I'll be relatively quick here. I like
Gentleman's
to always,
recognized for 5 minutes.
thank you. I like to get down to basics. First of all, just a few of the points that were made in that amendment. I respect the lady who presented the amendment, but I disagree with the amendment thoroughly. Elon Musk, when folks didn't know what political persuasion he was, or even folks thought maybe he was a Democrat, multi-billionaire, everybody loved him. Everybody loved him on the Democrat side. Great guy, the electric cars, innovation, all the things that he did. Now that we find out that he tends to be more of a conservative Republican and a believer in freedom of speech, he's a horrible, awful, terrible man. I would maintain it's not because of anything that has changed in what he has done or what his companies represent, but it's because now he's a conservative and a Republican. It's the same with Bobby Kennedy. Kennedy family, a great family in Democratic politics. But Bobby Kennedy Jr., turns out that he just couldn't hack it anymore, and he spoke out. And now he's a horrible, terrible, awful man. If he had stayed a Democrat and toed the line, he would have been a wonderful man. And suddenly, my colleagues on the other side, and you only bring this up because it was brought up in the amendment, going after Elon Musk. Now, Democrats are great fans of Liz and Dick Cheney. Dick Cheney, holy cow. Sometimes Dick Cheney scared me. Wow. And as the chairman so rightly pointed out, Mark Zuckerberg was clear. He is a Democrat, but he is ashamed of what happened when he was forced to censor certain things, not to allow freedom of speech on his platform. He came forward with that finally. In the beginning, it was reluctant, but he did. Freedom of speech is so damn important. It's everything that this country is based on: freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom to do what you want to do. And that has been lost to some degree on some people, unfortunately, on the other side. And then finally, it was brought up, and I just wanted to go through these one by one. My good colleague from Maryland, Russia, China, Iran getting involved in the election. I got to tell you, Russia, China, and Iran are not for Donald Trump. Believe me, they're not. So I guess the bottom line I would say is I would urge my colleagues not to support this amendment just on that very the basic premises that I bring up. I mean, to me, this is just not factual information. And, you know, I see the irony of it. And even during these difficult times, I see the humor of it. But in reality, this is a serious bill. It's a serious issue. And I think we should support the bill and certainly not support this amendment. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Would gentleman yield?
Yes, I yield to the gentleman from Ohio, our chairman.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. The gentleman from Maryland mentioned foreign entities trying to involve themselves in our election process, which we're all against. But I would just point out, this is a story, I think it's from the Rolling Stone, and was confirmed, I think, yesterday. But Trump campaign's 271-page dossier on J.D. Vance was hacked by Iran. Now, Iran just didn't hack something from the Trump campaign. What did they do with the information? Reported yesterday, they gave it to the Biden campaign. Now, this is something I'd like to know about. Who'd they give it to? How long did the Biden campaign have it for? I mean, there's all kinds of questions we need to know there. So yeah, we don't want foreign involvement in our election process, but the one thing we know that's happened thus far has been reported is Iran hacked the Trump campaign information on vice presidential candidate, United States Senator from our great state, J.D. Vance, and that information somehow found its way to the Biden campaign. I think there's all kinds of information we need to figure out about that, all kinds of questions. Who got it? How long they have it? When the FBI know about it? What was going on? All those things we need to know. That's something that this committee, I think, should be digging into, and we plan to do that. With that, I thank the gentleman for yielding and yield to the chair.
The gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Arizona seek recognition.
Thank you.
Gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
I appreciate that. I weighed into this argument with some trepidation, but I would just point out a couple things about the amendment in and of itself. Page 6, line 9, does not indicate what country the Supreme Court Justice Alexander de Moraes is from. I think that's necessary if you're going to have a complete and accurate record. But then we get to this whole series of things right toward the end that there's money going to different Republican candidates apparently. I'm not seeing any of it, I can guarantee you that. But what I will tell you is this: it imputes a motive here, and it imputes something that's would really be wrong, and that is an ethical violation. You cannot question motives, and that's what this does. It's a surreptitious way to get around the ethics rules here. But I just bring that up because I think it's unfortunate that happened. But I thought I would just mention, since you're harping on Elon Musk, and I just can't help but think of George Soros, your favorite sugar daddy for the Democrat Party, who since January 2020 through January 4th of 2023 had given roughly $500 million through multiple Open Society Policy Center, multiple organizations called Open Society University Network, Open Society Foundations Network, $500 million. As this article says, largely toward political causes aligned with the Democrat Party, and then going on through, you'll see that it's going to largely to Democrat candidates. I just think that's interesting as heck. Interesting as heck. And, you know, Mr. Chairman, I requested this article for, entitled The Formula for Success, Nonprofit Financed by Billionaire George Soros Quietly Donated $140 million to Political Causes, be admitted into the record.
Without objection.
Thank you. And I think that what this amendment did was an attempt to sully everybody, the sponsor of the bill, the chairman, this committee, and I think that is really, isn't the way this committee needs to go. We have enough problems without trying to impute unethical conduct and pecuniary bias. That really crossed the line, in my opinion. And that's a huge problem. If you don't like this bill, have at it, for Pete's sakes. We do that all the time, but I think the line was crossed here, Mr. Chairman, with the I yield back.
The gentleman would yield.